Hello everybody, I'm Hutch. Welcome back to Schola Fides, a channel that is all about theology for everyone. Because you see, you're already a theologian. You already have your own thoughts, opinions, and positions about God. And so what I am here to do, and what the channel exists to do, is to help you think biblically about those things. So today I want to help you think biblically about Jordan Peterson. Now, I think everybody's familiar with Dr. Peterson at this point. The guy's been all over the news. He is everywhere you look, in fact. And so I've already done one video where I talk a little bit about just kind of how I found Dr. Peterson. And so now I want to try and analyze Dr. Peterson's thought, but I'm going to do that in a very big picture way in this video. And there's going to be some theology kind of sprinkled through. So what is it in Peterson's thought that's attractive, and what is the what is the substructure of his thought is really what I'm trying to get at. And so the first thing is I think that Jordan Peterson, or Dr. Peterson, really does understand the deep or even prehistoric embedding of the Christian meaning structure, for lack of any better way to put it, of Western civilization. And so Christianity is, in a lot of ways, in ways that are very important, embedded in the history of the ancient Near East via the Judaism that produced it and that ultimately rejected it. That Judaism, in turn, is anchored in the ancient Near East, more broadly speaking. We have Abram, or Abraham, once his name is changed, coming out of the ancient Sumer. And so the meaning structure of Christianity really does find its roots all the way back to the very dawn of human civilization. And so it's because he realizes the reality, or that he recognizes the reality of this deep structure. In turn, he recognizes the absolutely inconceivable chaos that can and that will erupt once you start to tinker with that deep meaning structure and its place at the foundations of Western society and Western culture. And so if tinkering with it is going to produce this sort of unimaginable and just inconceivable chaos, then in his estimation, and in mine as well, what's going to happen, what sort of chaos will it produce if you attempt to expunge this worldview, which in fairness is a worldview that's almost completely assumed rather than ever really held up to the light and examined? Well, the answer is it's going to create a chaos that we aren't able really to get our heads around yet, and it's going to lead to some real trouble. And so it's at this point where I think Dr. Peterson's influence by Friedrich Nietzsche is so apparent. And so the similarities to Nietzsche, in my estimation, are really obvious. And if you guys have encountered Nietzsche, or you've read his philosophy, and you've actually understood it, then you'll know what I'm talking about here. If you're only familiar with Nietzsche by way of the teenage edgelords that are out there running around claiming Nietzsche as their mentor and guru, then you're not terribly familiar with Nietzsche at all. He has been very misrepresented, and he has been significantly misunderstood. And so one of the pieces that I think where Nietzsche's influence shows up is here. In his book, Will to Power, Nietzsche spoke of Christian morality as being irreplaceable, and he recognized the deep place that Christian morality held in Western civilization and in Western society. And so if you start trying to replace this irreplaceable role that Christian morality has played, then the result of that is going to be that totalitarianism starts to look like a really good idea. And so you can see that in, well, I think really clearly in Nietzsche's work, The Madman. And that's the one that everybody kind of knows quotes from, but doesn't necessarily know the whole parable that Nietzsche is telling there. And that's where the quote, God is dead comes from. And everybody reads that and comes at Nietzsche as this uh, atheistic thinker. And really, that's deeply unfair to Nietzsche, because one of the things that he's driving at in The Madman is saying, we are the ones who have killed God, and what is the result going to be? I mean, we've taken the world and ripped it off of the chain that moors it and that anchors it, and we're flinging it about in a way that we can't possibly see what the ultimate outcome is going to be. And so Nietzsche sees the destruction of the undergirding Christian morality behind society as leading necessarily to nihilism or totalitarianism. And when people are confronted with nihilism, then fleeing into the arms of totalitarianism or totalitarian thought really does become thinkable, because it's a whole lot better than the chaos of nihilism. And what's intriguing is that the passage where Nietzsche talks about the irreplaceable nature of Christian morality, in Will to Power, he opens that passage by saying, I am telling the story of the next 200 years. Now, that is not insignificant. We were warned that this was coming. We've had multiple warnings throughout history from philosophers and from others that if you start monkeying around with the deep structure and the deep narrative that ties our common civilization that we share together, you are engaged in an incredibly dangerous project, because you're not just messing with a deep structure that only goes back to the moment when Constantine makes Christianity legal. It goes much deeper than that. It's embedded, as I said, from the outset. This is embedded all the way back into our prehistory. And so you don't monkey around with something that has, from a pragmatic point of view, let's say, worked for the last 10,000 years. I mean, that's an incredibly foolish endeavor. But in the same place that you have this influence from Nietzsche, you can also see a significant influence on Dr. Peterson by Fyodor Dostoevsky, the great Russian novelist of the 19th century. Dostoevsky is effectively writing stories that present dramatically what Nietzsche was warning against philosophically. And so, one way to think of it is that Nietzsche provides the foundation philosophically for the drama that Dostoevsky is writing about. And so the way I think that you can see Dostoevsky's influence on Peterson is Dostoevsky's absolutely biting critique of rationalism and utopianism. And I think that the best example of that is Dostoevsky's book Demons, which really takes the themes of his earlier work, Notes from the Underground, and just, you find those themes writ large throughout Demons, which in my opinion is his best novel and is probably his most important one. So Demons really takes this big picture and just turns the volume knob all the way up to 11. And so this biting critique of rationalism and utopianism cannot be missed. And the influence of Nietzsche and of Dostoevsky are mediated or filtered through the influence of Carl Jung for Peterson. And I'm going to come back to Carl Jung in just a second. But Peterson, or Dr. Peterson, is, if you've listened to any of his lectures, really concerned about the rise of this sort of totalitarian utopianism in the thought of Western culture or Western civilization that we've been seeing uh, explode to the surface in Western Europe and in the United States, and also in New Zealand and Australia and South Africa, really since the 50s and the 60s. Is kind of where I think he and I, to an extent, would pinpoint where this totalitarian utopianism's uh, deep philosophical grounding can be rooted. So you see, when Dostoevsky writes Crime and Punishment and Demons and Notes from the Underground and The Idiot, what he's doing in the first place is kind of confronting this idea that humans are rational. And so there's this passage in Notes from the Underground where Dostoevsky says, and I'm summarizing here, right? You can use any words you can think of to describe humans, to describe men, but rationalism shouldn't be one of them. It should just hang in your throat, because if history teaches us anything, it's that men act in a way that is profoundly irrational. And so that seems so obvious to me that it hardly bears pointing out. I mean, for example, right? Especially if you're looking at creating a material utopia, which is the utopianism piece of this, because Dostoevsky predicts, I think, in my estimation, the rise of this materialist utopianism that's going to just overrun Russia, beginning in well, not beginning in 1917, but obviously in 1917 through 1922 with the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian Civil War. He predicts that, I think, in a way that's just unquestionable, particularly in Demons. I think that's the... If you want to read a novel from Dostoevsky, the three that I recommend, without a doubt, are Notes from the Underground, Crime and Punishment, and Demons, because I think those give you a great kind of overview of Dostoevsky's thought. And so Dostoevsky is pointing out that, like, even if you provide this sort of material utopia to men, you're assuming that they're going to react rationally to it. And you have absolutely no reason whatsoever throughout all of human history to assume that men are going to act rationally in those sorts of scenarios. And once again, like, I don't think that even needs to be proven, because we can see that all over the news. I mean, let's look at, Kobe Bryant and Tiger Woods as an example, right? Here are two guys that are just multi-millionaires that had access to basically anything that they could have possibly wanted materially, and they both blew up their marriages. And in Tiger Woods' case, lost, I think, like $250 million to his ex-wife in the process. Like, that's completely irrational. And so that's Dostoevsky's critique of this sort of rationalism joined with, a material utopianism. Like, so what makes you think that even if everything that you could possibly want were provided to you, that you would still respond rationally to any of that, and that you wouldn't go out of your way to just produce chaos and suffering, not just in your own life, though you will produce it there, but also in the life of, the people around you and the larger culture around you. And that totalitarian thought and that sort of utopianism elevates the place of the group over and above the place of the individual. And that's really what's behind a lot of Peterson's defense of, for example, free speech, is that, this game that we're playing with group identity politics is being undergirded by this totalitarian utopianism, is playing a dangerous game, because it's going to force the individual to get lost in the mix of the group identity, right? Which is exactly what happens in the history of the Soviet Union with the Ukrainian famine, the Holodomor, right? And so now it's at this point that we can kind of circle back around to the Christian worldview here. And so it's the biblical, the Christian worldview that forms this subterranean structure that both promotes the sovereignty of the individual and that defends it. And so that's the reason that Jordan Peterson has been warning kind of throughout everything that he's doing about the absolutely insane danger of monkeying about or of mucking about with the deep narrative of Christianity that undergirds our society. Now, I said that we were going to get back around to Carl Jung, so let's talk about that for just a few minutes. So, I think maybe the biggest influence on Peterson is the depth psychology of Carl Jung. And in my opinion, I think that right now Peterson is probably the most publicly well-known interpreter of Carl Jung to the masses. And so, and I think that to the extent that you misunderstand Jung, you're going to misunderstand Peterson, although there is a cleavage between them that I'm going to mention. So the influence of Jung can be seen in a number of areas. One is that Jungian insights or interpretations are all over Dr. Peterson's biblical lecture series. So the lecture series that he did where he was going through Genesis. And I think the other place where a Jungian-ish influence can be seen is in the high praise that he gives Mircea Eliade's book on or multiple volume book on the history of religion. And so Eliade is not a Jungian in the normal sense. I mean, in fact, Jung wrote a letter to Eliade that's pretty vicious. It's pretty savage in his critique. But Eliade's thoughts run down a really similar line to the thinking of Carl Jung. And so you have in Eliade this emphasis on the archaic man and the spiritual vitality of creation. And you see very similar lines of thought in Carl Jung. But both Jung and Eliade, where the similarity I think is most clearly seen in my estimation, is that they both saw Christianity as deficient. Now, they see it as deficient for different reasons, but they both see Christianity as deficient. Now, for Jung, Christianity is deficient in the symbolism that's necessary to bring about psychic or psychological wholeness and wellness. And for Eliade, Christianity had a insufficiently sacred view or sacred connection to the natural world. And so in both cases, the thought of Jung, specifically where the archetypes are involved, we'll talk about them in just a second, and Eliade, where this insufficiently sacred connection and view of the natural order is concerned, both of these are deeply influenced on modern neo-paganism, on modern shamanism. They're influenced in a number of areas that are mediated through the 1960s. And so I think that, well, okay, so if you want to understand Jung, you really do need to grasp the role and the place of the archetypes in Jung's thought. And so for Jung, there are, in the psychological makeup of the person, there is the ego, right, which is the conscious portion of your mind that is floating on the unconscious portion of your mind. But then this is all also floating on top of what Jung would call the collective unconscious. Or I think maybe put better would probably call it the collective imagination. And that because this collective imagination, this collective unconsciousness is shared across all of humanity, you will see these deep images that are common to all of humanity bubble up from the collective unconsciousness through the unconsciousness of the individual. And then it appears in the conscious mind, usually through dreams or through a process of active visualization. And the archetypes that most people would be familiar with would be like animus, anima, the shadow, the wise man or sage, the fool, those sorts of archetypes. And we can see those. And if you've read any great literature that you've really enjoyed, it's going to have been influenced by what we'll call the hero's journey, which is just once again, like it has all sorts of Jung's archetypal features that are just really written all over it. Speaking here of the hero's journey. And so I think that this actually explains in some ways the popularity of Peterson's lecture series, because if we're going to be fair, and that is something that we want to do, we do want to be fair to these folks as thinkers, then I think we cannot refuse to notice that there are some very real similarities between what Jung talks about as the archetypes and what older biblical scholars have talked about as biblical typology. And so with biblical typology, you see, this. Let's kind of roll this back a touch. So we can see biblical typology appear in a lot of older writers. So if you've ever read the commentary that Matthew Henry did on the entire Bible, so you can see typology in Matthew Henry. You can also see it in his contemporary and also commentator Matthew Poole. And so with typology, what we see is sort of two categories. We have type and we have anti-type. And so when we read about the temple in the Old Testament, we see that as a type of Christ. It's an image of Christ. And Christ himself sees it that way in the New Testament, where he says, tear down this temple and I myself will rebuild it in 3 days. But they didn't understand that he was speaking of the temple of his body. Okay, and so there is this similarity in some ways between Jung's understanding of the archetypes and the older understanding of typology, in that we do see in Scripture this deep structure that appears and reappears and reappears throughout the narrative. Now, Jung's archetypes are not typology by any stretch of the imagination, but people connect to biblical typology in a really significant way when you start showing these threads that connect Old and New Testament. And so I think that is at least part of why Peterson is able to hold the attention of audiences while he's talking about the biblical narratives, because he's tapping into some of the most interesting pieces of that narrative, but he's reading them through a Jungian lens rather than through a biblical lens. And I think that's one of the areas that is an area of concern for me with Dr. Peterson. And it's because I am of the opinion that Carl Jung is no less hostile to Christianity or to the Christian morality that Nietzsche said was, irreplaceable in Western thought and Western civilization than nihilism or totalitarianism are. And I think that there's good evidence for that in a couple of ways. One is there is really good evidence that Jung was a deeply pagan thinker. One of Jung's interests throughout his life was, alchemical manuscripts, as well as the sort of Gnostic literature that had been produced in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. And all of that is profoundly influenced Jung. And so that is a very strong pagan influence on his thinking. And I think that pagan influence can be seen in some other areas. There is a biographer, for lack of, and this guy isn't writing biography in the traditional sense, but there's sort of a biographer of Jung out there named Richard Knoll that's written 2 books, one called the Jung Cult and the other one called The Aryan Christ, that are about Jung. And I want to say here, because, in the event that someone watches this that's familiar with Knoll and that's familiar with Jung, I don't think that Knoll is fair to Jung in every area, and I think that there are some areas where Knoll's criticism of Jung is not accurate. And I would describe Knoll in some ways as a rather unscrupulous biographer. But nonetheless, if you've read, even Jung directly, you'll see that sort of pagan influence. And I think one of the most clear places that you're going to see that is in his book Ion, where he, again, connected back to this question of biblical typology. Jung he produces Christ and sets him before his readers as the archetype of the self. And so that's not entirely wrong. We do see this profound relationship to Christ as the perfect human that reflects to us all of our failures in so many ways, and who we need to be united to by faith, and into whose image we are growing, according to Paul, as regenerate, believing Christians. But Jung's understanding of Christ is entirely different from Paul's understanding of Christ. And so the similarities there are very superficial. But this is where I see the real disconnection between Peterson and Jung, and this is at a vital point in my estimation. So Jung oscillated between seeing Christianity and really ultimately all religions as being psychologically true, and seeing Christianity as, or let me put it like this, he oscillates between seeing Christianity as being psychologically true and expressing a extraordinary outright hostility to Orthodox Christianity. And so, for example, you can see that in his in the way that he encouraged some of his early patients, some of his early disciples, to break the vows of their marriage and engage in open relationships, and to sleep with just whoever they wanted to, and that was going to make them stronger as people. Peterson, on the other hand, in my estimation, sounds a lot like Martin Luther before he was converted. And I think that you can see that just so clearly in the conversation that he had with Dennis Prager. You can find that conversation on Dr. Peterson's YouTube channel. It was published on June 9th of 2019. It's called On Claiming Belief in God. So if you search that on YouTube, that should be the top result. And so Peterson grasps the gravity of belief in God, and in my estimation, he is powerfully aware of the necessary claim then that God makes on humans. And so in traditional Protestant terms, Peterson has felt the weight and the condemning power of the law, but he hasn't yet seen the beauty of Christ in the gospel. And so I think that in some ways may explain why Jordan Peterson is unintentionally leading people back into the church. And it's because he's done this superb job of pointing out to people the weightiness of the law, but he can't provide them with the rescue that's found in the gospel. And you can only find that in the church and in the proclamation of the word in the church. And so I hope that analysis of Peterson's thought kind of gives you a big picture, nutshell understanding of the influences behind Dr. Peterson's thinking. We're going to come back to some of these pieces, and we're going to examine them more closely in a future video. But that's all I've got for right now. So thank you guys for coming back and for watching the video. Look forward to seeing you again on Thursday. Hi everybody, thank you so much for sticking around for the end of the video. If you're being helped by the content that I'm putting out on this channel, please subscribe to the channel. That way you can get notifications when new videos are posted. Also, if you're enjoying this particular video or the others that you've seen, please give them a like. And also, if you have questions or you want to talk about any of this, leave me a comment in the comments section. I'd love to talk to you. Thank you again, and God bless you.